The Hiding Place. Chapter 15. The Three Visions. It was 3 mornings later when over the loudspeaker during roll call came, 10 boom, Cornelia. I walked forward. Why had I been singled out? The guard signaled me to follow her. I splashed through the slush, trying to keep up. My legs and feet were painfully swollen from the long count the day before. I hobbled behind the guard into the administration barracks. Several prisoners were standing in line at a large desk. An officer seated behind it stamped a paper and handed it to the woman in front of him. "Aunt Lassen," he said. "Aunt Lassen, released? Was the woman free?" Another prisoner stepped to the desk. A signature, a stamp, "Aunt Lassen." At last, 10 boom, Cornelia, was called. I stepped to the desk, steadying myself against it. He wrote, brought down the stamp, and then I was holding it in my hand, a piece of paper with my name and birth date on it, and across the top in large black letters, Certificate of Discharge. Dazed, I followed the others through a door at our left. There at another desk, I was handed a railway pass entitling me to transportation through Germany to the Dutch border. Outside this office, a guard pointed me down a corridor into another room for a release physical. The prisoners who had been ahead of me were tugging their dresses over their heads and lining up against the rear wall. I drew the Bible over my head along with the dress, rolled them together, and buried the bundle at the bottom of the clothing pile. I joined the others. When the doctor examined me, his eyes traveled down to my swollen feet. "Edema," he said. "Hospital." I scrambled back into my clothes and followed the trustee from the building. We started up the Lagerstrasse. "Then I'm not to be released?" "You will be, as soon as the swelling in your legs goes down," the trustee said. "They only release you if you're in good condition." We walked into the hospital and into a ward at the rear. I was assigned a bed near a wall where I could keep my swollen legs elevated. That was what mattered now, to get the swelling down, to pass the inspection. I went each morning to the clinic. Each time the verdict was edema of the feet and ankles. Many of those who attended the clinic were, like myself, discharged prisoners. Some had been released months ago. What if Betsy were still alive? Our prison term would have been up together. But Betsy would never have passed the physical. What if I were to pass the inspection and she? There are no ifs in God's kingdom. I could hear her soft voice saying it. His timing is perfect. In these final days, I looked for someone to give the Bible to. Not many in the ward would be able to read the Dutch text, but at last, I slipped it around the neck of a grateful young woman from Holland. Finally, the doctor at the clinic stamped the medical approval on my discharge form. Events now moved with bewildering speed. I was outfitted with clothes, underthings, a woolen skirt, a silk blouse, sturdy shoes, a hat, an overcoat. I was handed a form to sign stating that I had never been ill at Ravensbrück and that the treatment had been good. I signed. I was given back my watch and Mama's ring, and then I waited with a group of 10 or 12 just inside the gate. The heavy iron door swung open. We marched through. We climbed the little hill. Now I could see the lake, frozen from shore to shore. The pines sparkled in the winter sun like a Christmas card. At the small train station, the guard left us without a backward glance. We would all be traveling as far as Berlin, and then each would pursue her separate route home. The train trip itself became a blur. We reached the huge, bomb-gutted terminal in Berlin sometime after midnight. It was New Year's Day, 1945. Betsy had been right. She and I were out of prison. The trip seemed endless. Many miles of track could be traveled only at a crawl. There were long detours. Often we did not stop in a station at all, for fear of air raids. All the while, out my window, past once beautiful Germany, fire-blackened woods and ruined villages. We finally crossed into Holland. Flat, snow-covered fields glided past the window. It was still occupied Holland. German soldiers still stood along the tracks, but it was home. The train stopped at Groningen, a Dutch city near the border. Beyond that, rails were torn up. With the last of my strength, I limped to a hospital near the station. A nurse in a sparkling white uniform invited me into her office. When I told my story, she left the room. In a few minutes, she was back with a tray of tea and toast. "I left the butter off," she said. "You're suffering from malnutrition. You must be careful what you eat." Tears tumbled into the hot tea as I drank. "There were no available beds in the hospital," she said, "but one of the staff was away and I was to have her room. Right now I have a hot tub running." I followed her down gleaming corridors in a kind of happy dream. In a large bathroom, clouds of steam rose from a glistening white tub. Nothing in my life ever felt as good as that bath. I lay submerged to my chin, feeling the warm water soothe my skin. Just 5 minutes more. I would beg each time the nurse rapped at the door. At last, I let her hand me a nightgown and lead me to a room where a bed was turned down and waiting. Sheets, top and bottom. I could not get enough of running my hands over them. The nurse tucked a second pillow beneath my swollen feet. I struggled to stay awake. To lie here clean and cared for was such joy, I did not want to sleep through a minute of it. I stayed in the hospital at Groningen 10 days, feeling my strength return. The ache in my heart was to get to Willem and Nolly. At last, the hospital switchboard reached the telephone operator in Hilversum with the news of Betsy's death and my release. Hospital authorities arranged a ride for me on an overnight food truck headed south. In the early morning, the truck pulled up to Willem's big brick nursing home, and soon my arms were around Tyne and 2 of my nieces. Willem limped down the corridor with the help of a cane. We held each other a long time while I told them the details of Betsy's illness and death. "Almost," said Willem slowly, "I wish to have the same news of Kik. It would be good for him to be with Betsy and father." They had had no word of this tall blonde son since his deportation to Germany. I remembered his hand on my shoulder, guiding me on our bicycles through the blacked-out streets to Pickwick's. "Kik, are the young and brave as vulnerable as the old and slow?" I spent 2 weeks in Hilversum, but something in me could not rest until I got back to Haarlem. Nolly was there, of course. But it was the beach, too, the house itself that called me home. The problem was getting there. Finally, after many relayed phone calls, Willem told me the trip had been arranged. The roads were deserted as we set out to the rendezvous spot with the car from Haarlem. Pulled off onto the snow at the side of the road, we saw a long black limousine with official government plates and curtained windows. I kissed Willem goodbye and then stepped quickly, as instructed, into the rear of the limousine. The ungainly bulk beside me was unmistakable. Herman. I cried. "My dear Cornelia." His great hand closed around mine. "God permits me to see you again." I had last seen Pickwick sitting between 2 soldiers on the prison bus, his bald head bruised and bleeding. Now here he was. He seemed as well informed as ever about everything that went on in Haarlem, and as the uniformed driver sped us along the empty roads, he filled me in on all the details I ached to know. Our Jews were safe except for Mary Italy, who had been sent to Poland following an arrest in the street. There was no further word on her. Our group was still operating, although many of the young men were in hiding. He warned me to expect changes at the beach. After the police guard had been removed, a series of homeless families had been housed there, although at the moment the living quarters above the shop were empty. Loyaltus had returned and reopened the watch business. The optician next door had given her space in his shop from which she took orders to give to our repairmen in their homes. Now the limousine was threading the narrow streets of Haarlem into the Bartelgerstraat. I was out of the car almost before it stopped, running to the side door and into Nolly's embrace. She and her girls had been there all morning, sweeping, washing windows, airing sheets for my homecoming. I saw Tus, laughing because I was home and at the same time crying because father and Betsy, the only 2 people she had ever allowed herself to love, would not be returning. Together we trooped through the house and shop, looking, stroking, remembering. I stood on the landing outside the dining room and ran my hand over the smooth wood of the Frisian clock. I could see father stopping here. We mustn't let the clock run down. I opened the glass, moved the hands to agree with my wristwatch, and slowly drew up the weights. I was home. And yet my restlessness continued. I was home and I soon was working, but often I would come to with a start at my workbench to realize that I had been staring into space. The repairman Tus found, trained under father, were excellent, so I spent less time in the shop. I knew what it was I was looking for. It was Betsy. I had missed her every moment since she had left Ravensbrück forever. It was Betsy I had thought to find back here in Haarlem, in the home she loved. But she was not here. Now, for the first time since her death, I remembered. We must tell people, Corrie. We must tell them what we learned. That very week I began to speak. Through the streets and suburbs of Haarlem, I bumped on my bicycle rims, bringing the message that joy runs deeper than despair. It was news that people needed to hear, that cheerless spring of 1945, when no tulips turned fields into carpets of color, the bulbs had all been eaten. No family was without its tragedy. In churches and clubs and private homes in those desperate days, I told the truths Betsy and I had learned in Ravensbrück. At these meetings, I spoke of Betsy's first vision, a home here in Holland where those who had been hurt could learn to live again unafraid. At the close of one of these talks, an elegant lady came to me. I knew her by sight, Mrs. Behrens de Haan, whose home in the suburb of Bloemendaal was said to be one of the most beautiful in Holland, though I had never seen it myself. I am a widow, Mrs. Behrens de Haan was saying, but I have 5 sons in the resistance. 4 are alive and well. The 5th we have not heard from since he was taken to Germany. As you spoke just now, something in me said, Jan will come back, and in gratitude, you will open your home for this vision of Betsy ten Boom. 2 weeks later, a small boy delivered a scented envelope to the side door. Inside, in slanted purple letters, was a single line, Jan is home. Mrs. Behrens de Haan herself met me at the entrance to her estate. Together we walked up an avenue of ancient oaks meeting above our heads. Rounding the final bend, I saw it, a 56-room mansion in the center of a vast lawn. 2 gardeners were poking about the flower beds. We've let the gardens go, Mrs. Behrens de Haan said. But I thought we might put them back in shape. Don't you think released prisoners might find therapy in growing things? I did not answer. I was staring up at the gabled roof and the leaded windows. Such tall windows. Are there inlaid wood floors inside, and a grand gallery around a central hall, and statues set along the walls? Mrs. Behrens de Haan looked at me in surprise. You've been here? No, I said. I heard about it from. How could I explain what I did not understand? From someone who's been here, she finished. Yes, I said. From someone who's been here. The second week in May, the Allies retook Holland. The Dutch flag hung from every window, and the Wilhelmus was played on the liberated radio day and night. The Canadian Army rushed food to the cities. In June, the first people arrived at the beautiful home in Bloemendaal. Silent or endlessly relating their losses, withdrawn or fiercely aggressive, everyone was a damaged human being. Not all had been in concentration camps. Some had spent 2, 3, even 4 years hidden in attic rooms and back closets here in Holland. In Bloemendaal, they were reminded that they were not the only ones who had suffered. For all these people, the key to healing turned out to be the same. Each had a hurt he had to forgive, the neighbor who had reported him, the brutal guard, the sadistic soldier. Strangely enough, it was not the Germans people had most trouble forgiving, it was their fellow Dutchmen who had sided with the enemy. These former NSB collaborators were now in pitiful condition, turned out of homes and apartments, unable to find jobs, hooted at in the streets. I felt we should invite them to Bloemendaal, to live side by side with those they had injured, to seek a new compassion on both sides. But it was too soon for people working their way back from such hurt. The 2 times I tried it, it ended in open fights. So I turned the beach over to these former NSBers. This was how it went, those years after the war, experimenting, making mistakes, learning. The doctors, psychiatrists, and nutritionists who came free of charge to any place caring for war victims expressed surprise at our loose-run ways. At morning and evening worship, people drifted in and out. Table manners were atrocious, and one man took a walk into Haarlem every morning at 3 a.m. I could not bring myself to sound a whistle or to scold or to consider gates or curfews. But in their own time, people worked out their deep pain. It often started, as Betsy had known it would, in the garden. As flowers bloomed or vegetables ripened, talk was less of the bitter past, more of tomorrow's weather. As their horizons broadened, I would tell them about the people living in the beach, people who never had a visitor, never a piece of mail. When mention of the NS Beers no longer brought on a volley of wrath, I knew the person's healing was not far away. The day he said, "Those people you spoke of, I wonder if they'd care for some homegrown carrots," I knew a miracle had taken place. As I continued to speak, I traveled all over Holland, to other parts of Europe, to the United States. But the place where the hunger was greatest was Germany. Germany was a land in ruin, cities of ashes and rubble, but more terrifying still, minds and hearts of ashes. A great weight hung over that land. It was at a church service in Munich that I saw him, the former SS man who had stood guard at the shower room door in the processing center at Ravensbrück. He was the first of our actual jailers that I had seen since that time. Suddenly it was all there, the room full of mocking guards, the heaps of clothing, Betsy's pain-blanched face. He came up to me as the church was emptying, beaming. "How grateful I am for your message, Fräulein," he said. "To think that, as you say, he has washed my sins away." His hand was thrust out to shake mine. And I, who had preached so often to the people in Bloemendel the need to forgive, kept my hand at my side. Even as the angry, vengeful thoughts boiled through me, I saw the sin of them. "Lord Jesus," I prayed, "forgive me and help me to forgive him." I struggled to raise my hand. I could not. Again I breathed a silent prayer. "Jesus, I cannot forgive him. Give your forgiveness." As I took his hand, the most incredible thing happened. From my shoulder along my arm and through my hand, a current seemed to pass from me to him, while into my heart sprang a love for the stranger that almost overwhelmed me. I discovered that it is not on our forgiveness any more than on our goodness that the world's healing hinges, but on his. When he tells us to love our enemies, he gives, along with the command, the love itself. Many months later, a director of a relief organization came to see me. They had heard of my rehabilitation work in Holland. "We've located a place for the work," he said. "A former concentration camp." We drove to Darmstadt to look over the camp. Rolls of rusting barbed wire still surrounded it. I walked up a cinder path between drab gray barracks. "Window boxes," I said. "We'll have them at every window. The barbed wire must come down, of course, and then we'll need paint. Bright green, the color of things coming up new in the spring." Since then, working with a committee of the German Lutheran Church, Corrie opened the camp in Darmstadt as a home and place of renewal. It functioned in this way until 1960, when it was torn down to make room for new construction in a thriving New Germany. The home in Bloemendel served war victims until 1950, when it also began to receive people in need of care from the population at large. It is still in operation today, in its own new building, with patients from many parts of Europe. Willem died in December 1946. Just before his death, he opened his eyes to tell Tyne, "It is well with Kik." It was not until 1953 that the family learned definitely that Kik had died in 1944 at the concentration camp in Bergen-Belsen. Today a 10 Boom Street in Hilversum honors Kik. Peter Van Worden dedicated his musical gifts to God's service. He eventually traveled with his wife and 5 children as a family singing group, bearing the message of God's love throughout Europe and the Middle East. In 1959, Corrie was part of a group that visited Ravensbrück to honor Betsy and the 96,000 other women who died there. There, Corrie learned that her own release had been part of a clerical error. 1 week later, all women her age were killed. When I heard Corrie speak in Darmstadt in 1968, she was 76, still traveling ceaselessly. Her work took her to 61 countries, sharing the truth the sisters learned in Ravensbrück: Jesus can turn loss into glory. John and I made some of those trips with her, the only way to catch this busy woman long enough to get the information we needed to tell her story. Our best talks came during the times she stayed in our home. Our kids loved her visits, loved her ability to laugh at herself, like the time the chocolate ice cream from the first cone she had ever eaten kept running down her hand onto her blouse and shoes. No, Aunt Corrie. You have to lick around the bottom of the scoop. Watch, like this. Most of all, they loved the fact that each of them was as important to her as the loftiest church leader or city mayor. In her mid-80s, failing health brought an end to Corrie's missionary journeys. Friends provided Corrie a house in California, but even bedridden, Corrie never stopped witnessing to God's love. If you would come to cheer her up, you would be the one who would leave that bedroom, spirit mysteriously and gloriously renewed. At 11 o'clock at night on her 91st birthday, April 15th, 1983, Corrie, in the phrase she had always used, went home at last. Elizabeth Sherrill Elizabeth and John Sherrill met as young people on board the Queen Elizabeth and were later married in Switzerland. Together, they have published several thousand articles and written more than 30 books, including The Cross and The Switchblade with David Wilkerson and God's Smuggler with Brother Andrew. The Sherrills' writing has taken them to 5 continents, and their work still keeps them on the road, reporting the Holy Spirit's awe-inspiring deeds in the 21st century.